Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host, Aarushi, Kataria, and today with me, I have Sudisha Mishra. We're both junior research scholars at the Takshashila Institution working on the 20 Million Jobs Project. Today, we're here to talk about a state in India called Bihar. Now, we've always associated Bihar with people preparing for government jobs, extreme poverty, crime, literacy, a drinking problem that actually led to a complete alcohol ban in 2016, recurring riots, and a lack of development. Now, while the stereotype may hold true in some ways, all of these issues point maybe towards one particular problem, and that's a problem we're interested in, which is the question of unemployment. So, Sudisha, do you have any data and examples on the unemployment crisis in Bihar? How is it impacting the state? What are numbers we should look at and understand?
Right. First of all, thanks for having me here, Aarushi. So, fortunately and unfortunately, maybe we have a lot of data and examples which are there on Bihar, which very obviously point towards the problem of unemployment in the state. So, first of all, I think the most important data that exists is that unemployment in Bihar is actually double than the national average. So the national average hovers around 7 to 8%, and unemployment in Bihar hovers around at the current. And when you look at the status quo, it hovers around 14 to 15%. So that's just how bad the situation is in Bihar. And that's just like very basic data when you look at unemployment, right? When you look at other numbers, you can see that very surprisingly, unemployment is higher in urban areas in Bihar as opposed to rural. That could also mean that there aren't just enough jobs in the urban regions to absorb the educated youth, wherein uneducated youths are able to find menial jobs to do, for example, plumbing or repairing electricity and all that. Right. So those are some numbers that we should be looking at. We'll come to more numbers when we discuss why unemployment persists in Bihar and that has been a perennial issue. I also wanted to discuss some examples. So very recently, I came across this incredible article which was published in the print, which was on how thousands of students, and these are not officially enrolled students, these are teenagers in Bihar who are willing to study but do not have the means to do that. And they gather on the Ganga banks, and there are voluntary teachers who are coming to teach them. And this is an exercise that happens every morning. So when you go to that place, you can see like a lot of students just sitting on the stairs of the river and with their pens and papers and trying to study informally. Right. And the reason why they are doing this is because they know that there's no other way that they can get employed once they come of age. So they have to study, they have to prepare for government exams, which is like the only resort for them to get employed eventually. That's just one example. I think another great example of unemployment, the state of unemployment, to put it simply, in Bihar is that there is a village in Bihar called Exampur, where underprivileged kids and students, they go there, and it's kind of like maybe Kota in Rajasthan. But Kota is very commercialized, but but like that example is not that commercialized. But it's like an unspoken rule exists. Example exists for students who do not have the means to prepare for government exams in their districts and in their towns, wherever they live. So they go to example, they stay in very cheap lodgings, and they try to prepare for government exams. And just like that, we have these neighborhoods in major cities. So for example, in Delhi, we have old Rajendra Nagar, where students come from all over India to prepare for IAS exams. Just like that, we have places in Patna, so where students like 6, 7 students stay in like a one room apartment. And the reason why they are doing this is because they want to qualify for these government exams. So these are just some examples which are extremely harrowing in nature. The more you read about it, the worse it gets, because when reading, you realize that a lot of these students may not end up qualifying for any government exams given the limited number of seats that are there. And neither they know what's going to happen to them nor anybody else knows. So it's a very depressing scenario when you start reading about this.
Right now, I was someone who lived in Delhi. I used to stay in Old Rajdhanagar, so I know what you're talking about. But at the same time, it seems like a very chicken and egg problem. One can't understand whether unemployment is caused because people are, you know, trying to look for jobs, but at the same time still trying to study, and these exams are their priorities, or they only want a particular kind of job, or is unemployment being caused because the number of vacancies we have is really, far less than the number of people that are applying, which is the case in India. So what, according to you, are some issues that have probably caused this problem of unemployment in Bihar, especially given that it's not just a slightly larger number than the national average, but double the national average? What do you think has been causing this in particular in Bihar over the last few years?
Right. So I think the issue with Bihar, the unemployment issue that exists there is not as simple as, let's say, other states. So we did a podcast on Goa where it was very easy to pinpoint as to why unemployment is there. It was probably there for a very temporary amount of time, right? But in Bihar, the unemployment situation that one can see right now is because of very systemic problems that have existed and they are deeply ingrained within the society in Bihar. I'll try to list down those issues and give more details on that. But I think before that, it's important to look at some numbers. And I also want to point out that while I was researching for this podcast, I was reading a paper, and which was an incredible paper on the political economy of unemployment in Bihar. And for some reason, I did not see the year that it was issued in, and I just thought that that's the status quo. But as it turns out, it was a paper from 1995. So we are almost 27 years since then, but nothing has changed, right? Bihar has not improved. And as the paper states, it's the state that has withered away. There's a probability that if the status quo is going to persist, we don't know if Bihar can ever recover from the state that it is in. And the reason why it has reached this point, right? I mean, there are many reasons. One of them is the fact that Bihar has not been able to capitalize on its industrial potential. So when you look at Bihar as compared to the rest of the states in India, it has 1/4 of the minerals that are found in India, but they do not have an industrial landscape that can capitalize on that. A big reason for that, and not just one reason, I think many reasons are there beyond that. First of all, we've discussed this before in our labor law podcast, that it's very difficult to open an industry in India, right? You need to have electricity, you need to have construction permits, you need to have government support, you need to have credit for that. So there are a lot of reasons why an industry is able to, not just an industry, I mean, a factory is able to kickstart and it's able to sustain in any state. Obviously, anyone starting a factory in Bihar needs to have a lot of political backing. They also need to come out from a family that has a safety net to fall back upon, and they also need to have some industry knowledge. The way Bihar has been for so many years, right? It's just not possible for someone to have all the three. And maybe it requires more things, right? So because of these issues and because of other issues such as casteism and political corruption, industries have just not been able to flourish in Bihar, which is a really sad thing, right? Bihar is a big state. And if it wants, it can really open a lot of industries and it can solve its unemployment crisis. But it's going to be a long road to do that. Another issue why unemployment is so persistent in Bihar is the fact that Bihar has again not been able to capitalize on its agricultural potential. So we know that the northern belt, which stretches from Punjab to, let's say, West Bengal, it's one of the most fertile regions in the world, not just in India, which is also the reason why it's so highly populated. But Bihar has not been able to capitalize on that. And there are many reasons. One of the reasons that had me most surprised was that Bihar is a state which suffers from both drought and floods almost at the same time. So when you look at Bihar's geography, right, the northern part of Bihar is susceptible to suffering from floods, and that happens almost every year. I looked at data from 1990s, and I looked at data from 2019. Floods are in every year they went in Bihar, and the northern Bihar suffers from it constantly. The reasons why this happens is because no no facilities have been built in order to control the floods, right? The floods, they just, I mean, they are allowed to destroy northern Bihar as much as they want. And obviously, crops are going to get destroyed in the process. There's going to be soil erosion and all these issues. So the northern Bihar is constantly inundated by poverty and the floods, right? And now the issue with southern Bihar is that they do not have floods, but they are drought prone. And the reason why that happens is because they do not have the modern technology or the infrastructure to have irrigation. So this is a whole problem. For lack of a better phrase, it's a double whammy, right? That Bihar is just like drought and flood prone at the same time. So despite the fact that it's one of the most fertile regions in the world, it's just not able to capitalize on that potential because of these issues, right? And these are easily solvable issues. Like if the government wants, they can easily build better infrastructure for irrigation. It's something that has happened in many states in India. It's not something that Bihar citizens have to wait for so long. And at the same time, right? So I went to Mumbai the other day, and Aarushi, you stay in Mumbai. I was in Bandra Bandstand, and I saw these rocks, right, which have been built to prevent the high tide from coming to that area. So simple technology, right? But it's not like this cannot happen in Bihar. If the government wants it, if the government wants to prioritize, this can happen in Bihar, but it has not. So agriculture has definitely suffered, and right, and again, it's a compounding thing, right? Because it has happened for so many years, the problem has reached a level where probably it cannot ever recover unless it gets the financial and the infrastructural, government, political backing that it needs. So now we've only discussed two reasons. Then there are other reasons also. So I think the third reason would be, which is very prevalent, is that there is a big caste problem in Bihar. So if one just sits down to read about casteism in Bihar, it's like a whole other. It's like a book in itself. Right? There's so much to read. The rise of the mandals in Bihar and how people from lower castes they were able to come. They were able to take political positions where they can probably change. The lives of people from lower castes for the better, but they were not able to. Yes, right. There is data that shows that despite the fact that the Yadavs have been in a position where they have the political backing to do something right, economic development has been solely reserved for the upper caste. So I think one of the data that I can probably tell right now is that most of the land that Bihar is owned by the upper castes. Now you would think that political parties which have a lot of lower caste people, the Yadavs, for example, you would think that probably for being in power for 15 years, they would have owned a lot of land in Bihar, but that's not the case. That's exclusively reserved for the upper caste. And then we see that, like when we saw that in the recent elections, when you look at the people that were picked by BJP and Congress, you can see that a lot of seats were were reserved for the upper caste, right? Because when you look at the backdrop, they are fighting for something that the lower caste people were able to take to 50, 20 years of political persuasion and effort. So I'd say that this is a big caste, there's a big caste problem in Bihar. And what it tends to do is that the worst thing that it does is that it breeds child labor. Because obviously there's a big intersection between child labor and casteism. There is no way because we already know that, in India, there's it's a bit of status symbol when it comes to taking menial jobs while you study. But that's not the case when you come from lower caste because you have to make ends meet. So this is another reason why, apart from the fact that there's huge unemployment, we also have child labor because, so for example, a good example of that is many children in Bihar regions drop out of school because they are able to get jobs in Patna during marriage season. So they are able to lift the lights and they are able to cater in weddings. And they do that because their parents are unemployed and they are unemployed because of caste. So this is again a compounding problem that exists, right? So these are, I would say, the three main reasons why Bihar suffers from unemployment, and it's just getting worse with every year. But on top of that, I think a common problem that ties all of these things together is political corruption and bureaucracy in Bihar. So, the kind of corruption that exists, and it's known throughout India, right? Just the kind of, maybe we can call it racism that Biharis face when they migrate to other states in Bihar, especially Maharashtra. It's quite infamous for giving flack to Biharis for coming to their states and stealing their jobs, and that Biharis are prone to crimes and all that, right? All the stereotypes that exist for them. Big reason that exists is because of the political corruption that is there. Even when people are able to migrate to other states, they are not able to get employed, so they have to come back to the state and they get caught up in the this net of this nexus of bureaucracy and political corruption. So it just gets worse. So these are some, I would say, some major reasons why Bihar is suffering from unemployment. And uh, and yeah, I mean, the impact of that, I guess that, I mean, you can ask me the next question. I can talk more about how it's impacting and the problems that come from it.
Right. I mean, you just hinted at my next question, but I think on that note, let's take a short break before we dive into the last part of this podcast. Hello and welcome back. We were just discussing the major reasons for unemployment in Bihar. And as Sudisha pointed out, the next question will probably be about, what are the consequences of this? So, Sudisha, as you pointed out, partly unemployment in Bihar is a result of strong caste identity. Partly it, sort of feeds into violence. It feeds into corruption even more. It leads weak institutions, and those weak institutions further breed unemployment in the long run. But what, according to you, are the larger socioeconomic, you know, consequences of unemployment, especially that is, so prolonged that it's not a mere recession of 2 to 3 years. This is the everyday reality of Bihar, where if people actually get a job, one would say that, today something different is happening. So, what, according to you, would be the larger socioeconomic consequences of unemployment?
Right. I think the impact of unemployment in Bihar is multidimensional. There are so many things occurring at the same time that it's hard to pinpoint exactly what the administration should work on. So if you look at the 2016 elections that happened in Bihar, there was a ban on alcohol that was implemented throughout the state, which is why Bihar is a dry state now. But when you look at the root cause of why that's happening, it's unemployment, right? Unemployment and alcoholism. There is an intersection there. And I'll come to why that ban was probably not something which wasn't a great idea. But before that, I think I want to talk about this play called Look Back in Anger, which was I actually had it in my curriculum when I was in college, and it's a play written. I mean, it's a play written by John Osborne, which talks about a man who is from the working class in England, And so he goes to a university and he studies there. But when he graduates, he finds out that his peers are from the upper and middle class. So despite the fact that they've got the same education, he just does not have the opportunities that they have, right? Even though they have studied the same amount and probably even worked as hard. And the only reason for that is that he's from the working class. So what he does is that he comes back home and takes out that anger on his wife. And that's why this play is called Look Back in Anger. So even though this was written keeping the working class, the upper class in mind in England, I think that's very relevant to Bihar right now. When you look at the state of lawlessness and crime in Bihar, there are so many aspects to that it's hard to just pinpoint at something and say this is the main problem. No, it's not. So one good example would be spousal violence, right? It is estimated that around 83% of women face spousal violence in Bihar, especially when their husbands are drunk. So one could say that, oh, Bihar is a dry state. Why is this still happening? And the answer to that question is that even though it is a dry state, it shares borders with many other states which are not dry states. So Bihar has a border with Jharkhand, it has a border with West Bengal, right? So all the families that are living close to this border still have access to alcohol. And we know from years of experience that bans generally don't work, right? That's why even though Gujarat is a dry state, everyone knows that unofficially you can still get alcohol there. So that's alcoholism is one of the main issues that are and that have emerged because of unemployment, because the men just do not have something to engage in because they're unemployed, and all that rage and all that anger has to manifest in some or the other way. So alcoholism is one way, which leads to other problems like spousal violence, among other issues. um Another thing that I want to point out is that even though the government implemented an alcohol ban, that didn't really solve the root crisis why alcoholism was happening in the first place, which was unemployment. So now what's happening is that people who were addicted to alcohol can't get access to alcohol, but they want to still be addicted to something else. So now there is a rise in drug consumption in Bihar. So many, even young people, maybe from ages from 10 to 20, they are engaging in many drugs which are easily available in Bihar. So now the problem is even worse. Right now, they're just not addicted to one substance, which is alcohol. Now they are getting addicted to multiple substances, and it's going to be a huge drug problem if it continues to rise. Right, so that's one problem. Another thing is that we've always associated Bihar with a high crime rate, and that stereotype exists for a reason in a society where there's a huge economic imbalance, right? Crime is just bound to persist. It's bound to flourish, and it's not that there has been any improvement in Bihar. In 2020, around 2,400 murders were committed in Bihar, and around 1,100 rapes were reported. Now, I just want to point out that this is just official data that was reported. We don't even know how many rapes and murders were actually committed. And knowing the situation in India, we know that it's probably very high. So we might never know that number, right? So, and it's not something I even want to discuss because that's another topic in itself. So when you create a society where there is huge unemployment, students are not able to children are not able to study, they are engaging in child labor, and the youth is restless, angry, and frustrated, right? Obviously crimes are going to flourish, there are going to be murders, and women are almost always the main victims when it comes to anything. So there are also going to be spousal violence and rapes. And then there are other issues that often get ignored. So one of them is that child marriage is again flourishing in Bihar. So actually, there's a report that shows that the prevalence of child marriage in India is 47%, which is already way too high. But in Bihar, it's actually 60%. And a lot of times, these girls don't even know that they are getting married, right? So, and again, I want to use the phrase double whammy. It's because even if they're not getting married to someone, they are being sold off, and there's sex trafficking going on. So a lot of these girls are made to migrate to other states where they are just sold off, and they have to lead a life of prostitution. So these are just, these are problems that compounding problems, right? They cannot be pinpointed and they're not very straightforward. They are happening because of multiple factors. And like I said, when you sit down to just think or read about it, it's a lot. It's very depressing and it's very harrowing to just to digest that. So I think I want to end this point by saying that these are some major issues. But while all of this is happening, we are not even concentrating or even remotely paying attention to some of the other things. So, for example, in our 20 million jobs project, we often talk about women labor force participation. That's not even a point of discussion in Bihar. There are no jobs for the men to get employed. So, when will the discussion of women getting employed come, right? So, just imagine that scenario, that what are the women going through in that state? First of all, they are victims of the violence that men are committing. They are living in a constant state of lawlessness. There are no laws. Even the laws that protect them exist, there's just not enough personnel to protect them. So, probably they're spending a lot of time in their homes. Then there are just not education or employment opportunities for men to absorb. So obviously women come at the last, so there will be no jobs or educational opportunities for them to absorb. So just imagine what they are going through. Let's say that the government starts concentrating on unemployment as the main issue that they should focus on. It might get better for a while, but it'll get better for men. We don't even know how many years it'll take for women to for their condition to improve. So that's, I think, just some other reasons why we need to the government needs to urgently solve the problem of unemployment in Bihar, because there are some obvious things that we can see that youth in Bihar is rioting and they are committing murders and they are doing all these obvious crimes. But what about some of the unintended consequences? What about some of the hidden issues that might never, reach the pedestal of importance for any government or administration or any policymaker? Because there are just so many other obvious issues to work on. So I've already stated women labor force participation as one. There probably are many other issues that might never come to the forefront just because there's so many other important issues to focus right now. So I think it's going to be a very, very long road to recovery. And yeah, I think that's my answer to this question.
That was a really, really insightful conversation. Thank you so much. It really portrays what is going on in Bihar and, why we must be focusing on Bihar apart from the stereotypes that we hear about it. I do understand that this is just part one of a larger conversation that we're having about Bihar and how can Bihar do better? What policy should it be implementing? So until next time, thank you so much for joining me on this conversation about Bihar and the unemployment crisis.
Thank you, Aarushi, and thanks to everyone who listened.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.